climbs off all by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
Preparation for a flyby is somewhat involved. One example of a race was last Memorial Day. We opened the race at Concord, which because of sequestration, military is not able to do the flybys. So the Warbird community has stepped up and making the flybys really something special, and I think the fans are enjoying it and realizing what the community has to offer. They often do this, at their own expense for their own enjoyment, and especially when it's a tribute to the veterans, you can see all the Warbird owners step up. The TSA, there are flight restrictions around most racetracks because there are large assemblies of people. So we have to submit the qualifications of the crew. They do background checks. We have passport numbers that we have to submit to the TSA. Airplanes have to be certified. The pilots have to be formation qualified. And then you come to the briefing day. There are thorough briefings, who will fly in which position and who will be on the ground coordinating. We even go so far as to time the person singing the national anthem, and they have them sing it 3 times and get an average of the time it will take, whether it's 1:29 seconds or 1:35, to let us know at what time we can expect to be there. To be there on time is the challenge, and it's, yes, not only were we in position, but were we on time. Of course, you go out and practice beforehand, and any excuse to fly, we're all right there.
"1941. It wasn't just the American fleet at Pearl Harbor they wanted to destroy. The Japanese had many more goals: to take over the Philippines, Guam and Wake Island, Malaya and Singapore, and Hong Kong. Knocking out the American ships tied up in tiny Pearl Harbor was designed to immobilize our Pacific fleet as Japan mounted simultaneous attacks on those Southeast Asia islands and cities. The United States Navy would have made that more difficult. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, was a typically beautiful Honolulu morning, sunshine, gentle breezes and fragrances floating across the island and the beaches. The military aircraft on tarmacs at many airfields were not the only planes on the island. There was civil aviation too, and that Sunday morning was a perfect morning to cruise around in small private airplanes like many pilots fly today. Cornelia Fort was a private instructor pilot, giving her student a final check ride before turning him loose for his first solo, flying down Waikiki Beach past Diamond Head. Not a bad spot to start your solo flying. But that was not to be. 353 Japanese fighters and dive bombers made sure of that. Cornelia, her student, and their airplane made it. That story and a duck that survived too. Coming up.
My name is Connie Boland, and I am the founder and now the chairman of Warbirds in Review. I can't find anybody else who's not smart enough to, or is not dumb enough, actually, to take over this job. So I have a lot of volunteers, a lot of people that make this happen, and I'd like to thank them, starting with Kyle Guyat, who is our go-to person for all the details. Her husband, Scott, who has put together the intro videos. David Hartman, who wrote the script, then did the voiceovers for a really great video that you'll see here in just a moment, and then he will be our moderator for the rest of the program. They are phenomenally talented people, and I feel very fortunate to be working with them. Warbirds in Review is made possible through the sponsorship, our sustaining, I can say that, sustaining, and I fly airplanes, imagine that. Sustaining sponsor is Scott's Miracle Grow Company, Jim Hagedorn. They come in every year and support us at a tremendous level, making the media possible. FlyingOnDemand.com is where your friends can view this live as we are streaming here all day long, every day, FlyingOnDemand.com. The aircraft owners, we could not do this without the aircraft owners and the veterans who have shown up for many of the programs. We thank all of them. Jelly Belly Candy Company, big sponsor not only of the programs, but they bring the candy in to be a treat. And I think Kyle will be handing those out, as well as Veterans Coins, sponsored by Fagan Fighters World War II Museum. Also, Fagan Fighters offers their trailer for our use for the programming. So a thanks to all of those people and the other individuals who support Warbirds in Review. So we'd like to invite you to be a member of EAA Warbirds of America. Thank you.
Welcome. Please welcome Greg Anders, Chuck Greenhill, Allison Anders, and we're going to tell you some stories. Greg Anders, you may recognize the last name. He's a former Air Force F-15 pilot. He is the director of the Heritage Flight Museum in Burlington, Washington. He is also the executive director of the Lost Aviators of Pearl Harbor. Chuck Greenhill, sitting next to me, is the owner of that airplane, the Duck, and Allison Anders is the daughter of Greg. So that's where we'll start today. Greg, start us off. Cadet, what is this airplane, and how did it come to still be alive out here?
Well, the airplane itself is it was designed as a trainer, started in 1941, so this is the 75th anniversary of the Interstate Cadet, and that's part of the whole AirVenture experience this year, is to honor the Interstate Cadet. We got several of them here, had 18 at one point here, so that was pretty neat to see that many of these little airplanes left over. It was designed as a sort of high-end trainer at the time, so it was sort of the more expensive of the trainers, and but it was a very wonderful wing, great design, great little airplane for learning to fly.
How much more advanced was it than the trainers that it was trying to replace?
Well, to say advanced, you'd have to really just look at the wing, because I mean, this one has no electrical system. The early ones had no electrical systems in them. So it's a very basic airframe, but the wing is just a wonderful wing. So I mean, to me, it was the engineering and the concept of the wing and that type of airframe to get a good training environment for a great little wing. It's not as STOL as some of the other small airplanes, but it's a beautiful flying wing. I literally compare that wing to flying a Spitfire wing.
So where was this airplane on December 7th, 1941?
So this airplane was part of the, Ole Andrew had a flight in FBO out on Hawaii, and so it was on John Rogers Airfield, which is now Honolulu International. John Rogers as a name moved over to Barbers Point. But it was Honolulu International. It's Honolulu International today. So it was sitting on the runway there at John Rogers Airfield. It's December 7th.
And tell us about Cornelia Fort.
So Cornelia Fort, she was just an absolutely fascinating lady. The more I've learned about her, the more I just wish I could have met that woman back in her day. She was a Nashville debutante, and she was pretty, she was tall, and she was really smart. Now, those three characterizations, two of them are bad things for Nashville debutantes. So she didn't really fit into that environment. And she went out one day with a girlfriend of hers who was dating an instructor pilot and got a flight in an airplane at 10 o'clock in the morning. And she hung out all day at the airport till he was finished with all his other lessons so she could get her first lesson that day. She was bit by the bug hard. As soon as she experienced it, she loved it. 2 years later, she had her instructor license and just the whole works. She was really quick at getting all the training done.
Was that in Nashville or in Honolulu?
She did most of her initial training in Nashville.
Right.
And so she got a job in Denver for a little while, and then but in 1941, the interesting thing was, you know, she suffered the societal handicaps of perspective at the time. So in society at that time, it was basically considered that women couldn't fly. So she had a really hard time getting a job as an instructor teaching people how to fly airplanes. So she ended up getting a job in Hawaii, and that really fit in with what she wanted to do because she was a person that understood that there was a war coming, and the war was here for the world, and she knew that the United States would eventually be in it, whether we liked it or not. She really believed that in her heart. So she went to Hawaii primarily because she got the job, but secondarily, she knew that she could teach the defense industry guys that were then probably going to be the pilots and aviators in the war.
Wow. So the attack was at 7:48, the first bombs dropped.
That's right.
So where was she at that point? What was she doing?
So she was teaching a student who's a little bit lost to history. All we know is his name is So'umala, and she was airborne, giving him his pre-solo ride. Could you imagine if he had been cleared to solo and here the Japanese show up? But so they were in the pattern right over John Rogers Airfield, and she's in the back seat teaching. You know, and I'm sure that the student was looking down at John Rogers Airfield. He was getting ready to turn a base to do a landing, trying to impress his instructor, focused on all the right stuff. There's no radio, so he didn't have to cloud his head with a radio conversation. And Cornelia looks off to the side and sees this military plane coming right at her. Her first reaction is those darn Army Air Corps guys are in the wrong airspace. Pulls the airplane up, almost gets hit. And as the plane goes underneath her, she looks down and there's this red rising sun on the wing. And she goes, "That's not Army Air Corps." Looks up to the harbor and starts seeing the first bombs go off. So she knew that they were under attack by the Japanese. And so she takes the airplane, turns a quick base to final. She hears something go behind them, an airplane with the machine guns going. But all she's doing is trying to get on the runway. She lands the aircraft. They both get out as quick as they can, and they start running across the tarmac. A Zero comes by and strafes them as they're running. And they miss them, fortunately. She runs into the FBO and sells to everybody, "Hey, we're under attack by the Japanese." And everybody kind of looks at her and goes, "Cornelia, you're funny." And about 30 seconds later, one of the mechanics runs in and goes, "Hey, we're under attack by the Japanese, and Bob Tice just got killed on the tarmac." He had landed his airplane and did the same thing Cornelia was doing. He was running for the FBO for cover, got strafed, but he got hit and killed. So he was the first recorded casualty of Pearl Harbor.
So what did Cornelia do then? Did she stay in Honolulu or did she come back to the mainland or what?
Well, what she you know, they took cover for the day in the hangar, and then the attack was over. You got to remember the mindset at the time was the Japanese are invading. The part of the surprise of Pearl Harbor was that it was an air attack. They were really expecting an invasion. So everybody was very nervous. She tried to get off the island, but everybody was getting off the island, so she couldn't get a ticket. It took her like 6 weeks to get off the island. She wrote her will because she was sure that her boat was going to get sunk on the way to California. You got to remember, people were thinking the Japanese were invading. And so she managed to get home, got back to Nashville, and eventually got reunited with her family in Nashville, Tennessee.
And became a WASP.
She was the first of the WAFs to sign. Well, she was basically the second WAF to sign up. So she was trying to get involved with the military flying, and so she had her ear to the rail. And as soon as she heard, she went out there and got signed up.
And by the way, Saturday at 1 o'clock, we're celebrating WASPs, the female aviators of World War II, all week. And Saturday at 1 o'clock here, we'll be talking with a former WASP and other incredible female aviators of today, including Connie Boland, who happens to be one of those. So if you're interested in the WASP background and history, come join us at 1 o'clock on Saturday. Thinking about the generations of female aviators, Greg. Now, here's your daughter, right?
That's right.
Allison, and she's the third generation. By the way, this makes the third generation in this family because what you may not know is that her grandfather, Greg's dad, is Bill Anders from Apollo 8. He took that picture of Earthrise. Jim Lovell will tell you he took it, but he didn't. Bill Anders took that picture. But anyway, so here is 3 generations. And Allison, where are you now in the process of learning to fly?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead. He'll turn it up.
Start talking.
Well, I'm working towards getting my private pilot's license. I soloed last summer, and I'm trying to take lessons at the same time as school, and so taking it slowly, but hopefully going to get it done soon.
How much pressure is there within the family, Allison? Own up here.
There is a lot of pressure, but I don't really feel it. My family's pretty supportive of me becoming a pilot, so.
I'll bet they are. That's just great.
So she soloed in her 172, but she is fully capable of landing a beaver on wheels. So we're getting her into the tail dragger world.
She's getting there already.
So-
Allison, that's cool. That's just great. And you're how old?
I'm going to be 20 in August.
Reaching 20 years of age. That's
20
awesome.
years of age. And David, one of the main reasons I wanted to bring her up here today is to remind everybody this is how old the WAFs were and the WASPs when they were first signing up. So, I mean, this, what we consider to be this young girl is really these women that were hoping to walk out to B-17s and P-51s and start moving around the country in an effort to support the country in the war effort.
Yeah, exactly. Chuck, we'll come back to the cadet in a minute. Chuck, and here you are. We haven't bored you. You're still awake? Microphone.
Doing fine, yes.
What is a duck?
Well, it was what was a modern-day airplane in 1939. And anyway, it was the best of the best. There was the search and rescue for the Army and Navy, and they had them all around the country. This particular one was in Hawaii in 1939. So anyway, it was in Pearl Harbor the day of the bombing, probably one of the only airplanes today that have that distinction of being in Pearl Harbor the day of the bombing and still flying in the United States.
And where was it that it was able to survive the attack, which was so incredibly relentless for 2 hours?
Well, it was on the airfield. It was in the military airfield, and it got damaged in the attack. And anyway, it was rebuilt, and after the war, it didn't do anything in the war, but after the war, it became a civilian airplane, and that's where we kind of got into it.
If it's search and rescue, how would they rescue people? Understand about the search part, but what about the rescue part?
Yeah, they were landing these things in the middle of the ocean in an open sea. It just seems incredible to me because a couple of feet of water seems like a lot of water when I land it. But they were landing in these 6-foot swells, and there's 2 little side windows, and if you look at the black line, that's the water line on the airplane. So you can see that a life raft would be right at those
What's that
windows.
that black line was
Yeah,
the water
is
line?
the water line that she sits in the water at, yes, at an idle. And anyway, they'd get the life rafts to come right up alongside, and there's a couple of seats in the airplane, but I know for a fact they've had as many as six people in that underneath,
Wow.
as well as a pilot and co-pilot, and took off in an open ocean situation with it.
Right. What can you tell us about the restoration of it, and when did that happen?
Well, I didn't get the airplane right from the recovery. A friend of mine, a now friend of mine, Bill Floden, actually recovered the airplane, but it had sunk in the 50s in a inland lake in Hawaii. And it sat there for 30 years, and nobody was interested, and everybody knew it was there, and it just, it didn't have any value or appeal or anything. And anyway, Bill went in there, and he dove down on the airplane, and they put flotation devices under the wings and so forth, and they lifted it up and brought it to the shore and hauled it ashore and cleaned it up and started the restoration. He didn't get very far, but he got started, and he realized what a big job it was. But kind of one very interesting part of this restoration is the upper fuselage area was not too badly destroyed by this crash in the inland lake, but the float was actually broken in half and just totally destroyed. And anyway, we were flying our Aerostar, our private airplane, down to a little airport. I think it was in Tennessee. And I'm walking along, just kind of wasting time, waiting for some gas, and I see this boat-looking thing on the side of the hangar there. And some guys had obtained this float from the fuselage down, and were using it for a fishing boat. They put a trailer hitch on the tail end of it, and when they'd want to tow it, they would just wind the wheels down and tow it to the lake. When they got to the lake, they'd bring the wheels up and back it in the lake and bring the wheels up, and use the thing as it had an outboard motor they put through a hole in the bottom and drove it around the lake and came back. So anyway, we found this thing sitting there, and sure enough, that was the float, and that's this float that you see here. We did very little work to it to restore it. It was actually in terrific shape.
Were those guys, do you think they'd ever heard of a thing called a bass boat?
I don't know, but I gave them very little money for it at the time, and they were happy, and they just thought they had.
The whole restoration process, how much of this airplane was the original airplane? How much of it had to be either rebuilt, engineered, created?
Very little of it is actually original. Here and there's a little stringer or a cross member or a strut that was original. Yeah, but the side metal has all been replaced. It was corroded, and of course all of the instruments and everything. The panel was just completely destroyed. 30 years in the water. It was fresh water, so it wasn't corroded, but it was.
What about the wings and struts?
I think very little of that is original. Here and there's a spar or a connection that's original, but we built a ton of stuff for this airplane. Just fixture after fixture and part after part to make this thing an airplane.
Where is it? Where do you keep it now?
We keep it in Kenosha. We have a hangar there with several of my Warbirds, and as you know, I'm a collector of water airplanes. I love flying airplanes on the water. I have a Goose, and we had the Albatross, and just a bunch of seaplanes all my life, lake amphibians. So when I saw the opportunity, I also love Grumman airplanes. When I got the opportunity to get a duck, why I just latched right onto it. I couldn't pass it up.
And how many years have you had it now? Ballpark?
12, 15
12,
years,
15.
something in that area, yes.
How does it fly?
It actually flies very well. It has terrible visibility on the ground, so I think the hardest part of the airplane is taxiing it. And of course, there's no steering, no connection to the tail wheel whatsoever, so all you can do is differential braking to turn the airplane. And you do get used to it, and between the power management and the braking, you can get the airplane into small, tight spaces, and it seems to work out. But it's certainly not something that you could just get into and do, put it that way.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Back to the cadet, Greg. What's this plane like to fly?
For me, I was military trained, flew F-15Es, A-10s, and B-52s, so I'm kind of a big airplane guy. I come back to flying this airplane, and the actual flight characteristics of it are just exquisite. I absolutely love it. I'm still a little intimidated by only having 65 horsepower, but I'm learning.
But you had to fly it across the mountains, right?
Allison and I brought it cross country all the way from the Seattle area, Burlington, Washington, to here. And it's a wonderful little machine, and I learned on the trip over here that if you just leave the throttle full open, keep the airspeed indicator on 60 miles per hour, she will climb and just keep climbing. And we got her to get over Yellowstone and that area. We were planning to go to Bozeman, but when she reached 12,000 feet, I figured I was safe enough to cut the corner. So I cut the corner and we went over into Billings, basically.
Right.
So it's an amazing, get this, I had ForeFlight, I had to take a picture of it on my phone. 12,000 feet, 102 knots ground speed with this little airplane.
Wow. How much of this airplane, yours, is original and how much is recreated?
So I bought this airplane after the restoration from Kent Peach. Kent, of course, flies the Interstate Cadet for his Air Show Act, the Jelly Belly Interstate Cadet. So Kent was buying a pile of parts of Interstate Cadets to help him rebuild some as well as have parts for his airplane. And what it is was the airframe itself is airframe serial number 109. But everything else had been separated. This airplane, it's a little bit longer story. It had gone in through an estate process. And I think that's where the story got separated from the airframe itself. And it ended up in a scrap heap. And that airframe was actually pretty close to getting into a smelter. So we would have completely lost this history and it would have gone away. But Kent found it. He confirmed that with Tim Talon. Tim Talon did the restoration. And when Tim did the restoration on this very special airplane, he tried to do it to the T. So, I mean, the bolts have the proper stamp on the top of them for the era of 1941. That tail wheel on the back is the 1941 tail wheel. It is a pain in the neck, but it's neat to have that original tail wheel. So
why is it a pain in the neck?
It doesn't fully caster. Yeah, it doesn't fully caster. It doesn't have that breakaway like a Stearman does or something like that. So you can do that tail wheel pivot. So it has a very limited steering. So I'm kind of listening to Chuck talk about using the duck on this. This thing, everybody expects a tail wheel to be able to turn 90 on the ground. This thing can't. So you're very limited turns, and it's easy to break if you try to push it backwards. So it's all of these inconveniences that we learned afterwards. After doing it for a while, came up with better ideas. But this airplane has a lot of little areas where they're just not convenient, but it is extremely authentic. Little fuse brakes on there are very different. You can get on the side. You can see the fuses on the side. All of that very original to the June of 1941 construction of this aircraft.
Now, I understand that Cornelia Fort lost her logbooks in a fire.
Well, that's my
shame.
Hypothesis. Yeah, there is one of the issues with the history of this aircraft is that Cornelia Fort's logbook has a different registration number in it. So when I bought the airplane from Kent, the history was very disputed. And so I agreed with Kent. I said, look, I'm looking for a small airplane that I can work with Allison on for training and that kind of stuff. And so he was in a position where he just had to kind of sell it. So at the bar at ICAST, the International Council of Air Shows convention we do every year, at the bar, I agreed to buy the airplane. It was an expensive beer,
You
but it
do
was
these
worthwhile.
things, yeah.
So I did the research. I've got other things going on. So it took me a long time to really get the research accomplished. But what I ended up finding was 37345 has no records of ever being in Hawaii. In fact, it was based in Tucson, Arizona. So we start looking back at the history of 37345. I got the FAA records, and 37345 was born, came off the factory floor October 17th in 1941. So I went deeper into Cornelia's logbook, and this took a while. This is a really short story for what took over a year and a half to kind of, the epiphany to occur. And looked at her logbook, and she flew this plane on September 21st, 1941. Several weeks before it even came off the factory floor, according to her logbook. So that can tell you that then there's a flaw in the logbook. That's where the theory of her logbook, she kept her diary, she very prolific diary writer, and she kept her diaries at her family home while she was with the WAFS because she knew she'd be moving around a lot and wanted to keep them safe. Well, unfortunately, her safe haven for her diaries also caught on fire and burned down. So I believe her logbooks burned up as well, and like an enterprising pilot, if you want to get a job with the airlines, you can't walk into the airline interview and go, hey, I've got all these hours, but my logbook burned up. So, especially as a female in that time frame. So I think she was smart. She identified in letters home that her diary had burned up, but she never identified the logbook burned up. But there's this logbook that has this entry in it is logbook number 3. Nobody knows where logbook 1 and 2 are. And so that kind of kept me leading down towards this hypothesis that her logbooks were with her diaries. And so she was recreating her logbook. She was she kept a lot of her notes. She kept most of her orders that the Army Air Corps gave her for deliveries. And so she could actually pretty reliably rebuild her logbook. But what she didn't have was the registration number of the interstate cadet she was flying during that major moment. And everybody asked her that. And so she stumbled across 37345 where it was based in Tucson, because she was doing BT-13 deliveries from Long Beach to Love Field, and she would stop in Tucson overnight to visit a friend, as well as a good place to stop. So I think that's where she picked up the 37345 number, so that she knew the airlines could look at it and go, Interstate Cadet 37345 FAA records, Interstate 37345, yep, that's an Interstate Cadet. They wouldn't go beyond that, but that's how they would validate her logbook.
But despite not controversy, but some of the questions involved, just the fact that this plane exists today is a great piece of history.
Yeah, and this is the so what it became, the logbook is primary data usually. We call that primary data. So it's what the person wrote down. So if the primary data was flawed, this is the airplane, 37266 is the airplane that carried with it the verbal legend. And all of its time on Hawaii, that's Cornelia Fort's airplane. So Marguerite Gambo, Ma Woods, owned an FBO on Hawaii, and she always used to tell anybody that owned this, anytime, back in the 70s, a guy named Pierre Michel, his father, owned the airplane. He always was told when they lived in Hawaii, this airplane will always get gas because this is Cornelia Fort's airplane.
Wow. Given what you said, the challenges of flying this are for you, how another piece of history, the tri-motor.
Another piece of history, reliving itself. That's awesome.
Right. How comfortable are you with Allison flying this airplane until she has more time?
Oh, I think I'm pretty close. It's the heel brakes. It's a different mindset for using heel brakes on a tail dragger over the Beaver. If she's in college, so that is a lot of work going on there. So I'd feel pretty comfortable letting her go in the Beaver here pretty soon. And this thing, if it wasn't the Pearl, I'd be comfortable letting her fly right now. But you got to kind of steward your aircraft a little bit more firmly when it has such an interesting provenance.
Right. Questions and answers. How many of you would like to ask any of our guests some questions about these airplanes or their histories? Anybody out there? We've covered it pretty well, but maybe somebody. Yes, sir. Up in the back.
Oh, boy.
That's Kyle, by the way. And while she's going there, Kyle, we have challenge coins available. And after we finish this part of the program, if you'd like a Warbirds challenge coin, see Kyle. She's got them. Sir.
I have a book that talks about an Aranca 65 TC at Pearl Harbor. You're nodding your head. You know this controversy or this story. and maybe there were more than one airplanes in the air that the Jap shot at. Can you talk about that? Because I've recently heard of the interstate story as well.
Absolutely. And so when I found myself in a position to take possession of this incredible piece of potential history, did the research to clarify that, how many people out in this crowd right now think there was one airplane over Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was attacked? I know I kind of did. There's this sort of myth and legend that there was just one airplane airborne. There were 8. So I started a website called the Lost Aviators of Pearl Harbor.org, and it's just in its infancy, and I hope somebody can take it to that next level beyond me. There's a friend of mine in Hawaii that will probably do it when he retires from the FAA. But there were 8 airplanes airborne that day. And so to tell the story of each airplane and not amalgamate them all into one bad biplane in the movie Tora Tora Tora, but there were 8 airplanes airborne that day, and I really want to try to get all 8 of those stories out there, because here's 8 people that took off on a general aviation, lovely Sunday morning flight, and they end up in the middle of a war, the beginning of a war. So the Aranca 65TC is one of the other airplanes that was up there. Roy Vitusik was flying that one. Marguerite Gambo was airborne. Bob Tice was airborne. There were 4 guys and 2 cubs that went out over the ocean just to screw around a little bit. They were never heard from again. Shot down and killed. And so there were 8 airplanes airborne, and so when Pearl Harbor was attacked, think about it. How many people sat down and wrote down exactly what happened at that moment? No, they were too afraid. They were afraid the Japanese were going to invade. They were taking care of their wounded friends. They were picking up their dead friends. So the history of Pearl Harbor and those emotional, personal stories, many of them are lost. And so we're just trying to preserve as much as we can, and that primary story from Cornelia Fort was such an active one that's one we can fairly easily preserve, and we are so lucky to have found the airframe to bring it back and to tell that story. That square your question away? 8 airplanes, and so the Aranca was just one of 8.
Kyle.
Yes. What is the normal crew on the duck there, and how do you get up to the cockpit? You crawl in the side and get up in there?
Yeah, there's a step on the side, and we've actually added a step because of my 82-year-old step not being as long as some of the kids at 19. But it is a job to get up onto that thing, and the normal crew is 2. There is a pilot and an observer, and that would be how the military flew it. And I fly it by myself most of the time, or a lot of the time.
Good. Anybody? You know, there's one other, since we're talking about other things that happened that day, what we haven't brought up is the question of whether any of the military aircraft actually got off the ground. There were 2 second lieutenants, Army Air Corps second lieutenants, P-40 pilots. They had been at a black tie mess dress party dance the night before, and after the party was over, the dance was over, they got into a poker game and didn't go to bed until 6:30 that morning. But when they heard, the bombs going off, they called their field, said, gas up, get ammunition on 2 airplanes, and we're on the way out. They threw on their tuxedo pants and a jacket and went out, and both got off the ground. They flew 2 missions, they got 2 kills each, plus probables, and they were both nominated for the Medal of Honor. They didn't receive it, but they were both nominated for the Medal of Honor, and that was Ken Taylor and George Welch. That's another one of these stories from what happened in those 2 hours that morning, December 7th. Kyle.
Yeah, so what is the range of the duck, and how long could you stay in the air with full fuel?
It'll run about 3 hours on the tanks that are there to run out. So a couple hours is actually all that they'll fly. And after 2 hours, you'll really want to get out of it. It's a very smelly, noisy atmosphere, and you're very confined, as you are in any of the fighter-type airplanes. But anyway, that's kind of what we're looking at here.
Chuck, what does that say about you that you like flying in a smelly, stinky airplane?
I don't know. I guess that's just kind of my habitat.
Any other questions? After we're finished with our part of the program, there's another story from that day, and it's the story of a Nihao Zero that crashed on a tiny little island in the Hawaiian Islands. And Sid Jones and his wife, K.T. Bud Jones, have written a book about it, Nihao Zero. And after we're finished with the program, K.T. is going to be over in the bookstore signing this book. And it's a fascinating story about a Zero that crashed on one of the Hawaiian Islands, and the pilot survived for 6 days. It's another one of these amazing stories from those 2 hours in the morning. So, thank you all very much. Sam Bass is now taking over with Allison and Greg and Chuck to talk about these airplanes and walk around. Sam.
Thank you, Dave. Actually, it probably is not going to be that much to it because you've pretty much covered what we're going to talk about here. We've been talking about the airplanes, and that's all there is to talk about. But let's talk with Chuck. Let's talk about your airplane a bit. You can talk about the specifications because we haven't covered that, what kind of engine it has, props, what have you.
Yeah, well, that's a 1820-30. It's a direct drive 1820 motor. It's at 790 horsepower. And of course, the modern day 1820s or the later 1820s were pulling almost twice that horsepower. And anyway, on this airplane, it's just really loafing. The engine is really loafing. It seems to pull it along pretty good when you put the power in. It's very lively. You feel the acceleration. It puts you back in your seat. The wheels come off. The tail wheel comes up very quickly, and the airplane's airborne in a surprisingly small distance.
Now, is this pretty typical of another seaplane? That you fly all these amphibians? Does it fly pretty much like the rest of them?
It flies like a biplane.
Oh, okay.
So it's Stearman-like in a lot of ways, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And no, it gets off the water or the ground at a lower speed than my other seaplanes, the Goose or a Widgeon, and it seems to fly a lot slower, or you certainly have control at a slower speed. Let's put it that way.
Well, it looks like the visibility is pretty poor when you're on the ground.
It is, and that's the real disadvantage of the airplane, is that when you're on the ground, you have to really zigzag to see ahead of you and plan where you're going and know where you're going to be, particularly when you come to Oshkosh.
Yeah. Well, how many of these were built during the Second World War, or before the World War, I guess?
About 600, just under 600 were built, and I don't know of any other. Well, there's a couple of Dash 6s out there, but none of the Dash 4s like this.
So then you mentioned earlier that Kermit Weeks says the only other flyable. Is that correct?
He's the only one I know of that flies it. There's another one up in Seattle somewhere that is a museum airplane, but I don't hear about anybody flying them. I've never talked to anybody who's flown one of their airplanes. But I do hear that Kermit Weeks does fly his every now and then.
Now, what services use this?
They weren't a very popular airplane. This was an Army airplane here.
Oh, it was?
And
okay. Any particular quirks to it or tricks to flying it?
Well, you have the tail wheel lock on it, and of course, like a lot of biplanes, you have to remember the tail wheel lock to keep it straight on the takeoff. But no, the airplane is pretty straightforward, and it lands at a very slow speed, so you don't have any of the quirks of having an airplane on two wheels. And jumping off this. It seems like it's pretty easy for me.
Well, you say a slow speed. What do you mean? Say 80?
60-ish.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah,
slow.
yeah. It's touching down in the 60s.
Well, how does it behave in a crosswind?
I don't fly it in a lot of wind, but it seems to be very honest. It's got a lot of aileron, and I'm able to get it in and out of there right on the center of the runway. Just touch down on one wheel as you would with any airplane. The tips seem to be plenty high off of the pavement, so you don't have any problem with the floats touching the pavement. So I've gone in 20, 15 knot crosswinds.
That's pretty good then.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, just one last question here. How about the color scheme?
Well, we tried to duplicate what it was in Pearl Harbor the day of the bombing. So this is what we think it looked like. And we had some pictures of the airplane, so it seemed pretty much that was the scheme they used back then, and that's the squadron, the markings are the squadron that was in, their markings, and that's how we try to replicate the airplane.
Well, thank you. You've done a wonderful job, and it's a beautiful airplane, and thank you for your time. We'll just spend a little time with Greg here and let Greg tell us all about this cadet because he seems to be a master.
Thank you.
They took your wire off.
They took my wire. It was raining. They didn't want me to get electrocuted.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your airplane.
Well,
what you haven't already told us.
Well, the Interstate Cadet, the lovely thing about it for me is it's just such a simple airplane. So you really get back to just the joy of core flying and enjoying that. So to me, that's what's really special about her.
Well, you know, when you look at it and you look at a Cub right beside it, it's a good bit bigger than a Cub.
It's a little bit bigger. It's got a thinner wing on it, less of a stole type of wing. So when you get to the Cub Tailorcraft, they're better at lifting for short fields. This one's just, I think, a better flyer, though.
Well, I understand that this airplane, when it was new, cost probably what, 2.5 times more than a Cub?
Yeah, it was significantly more expensive.
Why did they select this as an instructor? What was the advantage of having this airplane over a Cub? Do you have any idea?
It's such an amazingly honest wing. I think that Ole
Why don't we
Andrew,
stand underneath this wing, by the way?
Why don't we stand? Yeah, I like that idea. A little rain shadow.
Yeah.
Ole Andrew is the guy that bought several of them, took it to Honolulu. Right. So I think he just knew that it was just going to be such an advanced, a wonderful training wing to teach people how to fly and how to fly well.
Well, how many of these are still around, do you think?
There's less than 50. There's a little over 300 built, but they're coming back. Tim Talon from Ragwood Refactory, he's the guy that really understands and knows the history of these airplanes. He's brought several back. In fact, he was laughing. He had 6.5 of those airplanes that were here this weekend as the Interstate Cadet were his airplanes that he had restored. So he's really doing a great job of bringing these airplanes back to the community and back to a more understood position within the aviation community.
Well, what's the horsepower on the airplane?
Well, I've got an Continental A65 in here, and I've got it built up right to 75 horsepower.
So they only had a 65 in there.
Well, they put bigger engines in later, but in this particular airframe was initially delivered with that A65.
And so I don't know I can't remember whether you covered that or not, but what cruise speed do you get out of it?
Well, once you get up to altitude, you're generally cruising about 70 miles per hour on the indicated, but I climb out at 60 and she'll just keep climbing. That wing it's a great little glider wing. I mean, you watch Kench Peach do his power off demo with this thing, and it's just a graceful, lovely experience to watch it fly.
So you guys didn't have any problems at all with that little 65 going over the mountain?
Well, it did it. But my little concerns and everything were pretty high, so I learned a lot in that whole experience.
Yeah, because airplane noise, I love it.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, is there any significance to the color scheme on here?
Well, this was the Interstate color scheme, and so there's no pictures of the airplane when it was on Hawaii. So this is one of the two primary color schemes. In fact, at the time of the manufacture, this was the color scheme that Interstate was producing.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Greg. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.